Flights are grounded. The losses work out to about $250 million a day. Experts say even when airports reopen, security measures are likely to mean it is many months before air travel is back up to speed. Because of that, analysts say the industry very well may exceed the $2 billion loss suffered the year of the Gulf War. Now, we've already seen Midway Airlines, which has been struggling financially, say they have suspended all operations and have laid off 1,700 people immediately. And it is not just U.S. airlines. Asian carriers are seeing their losses mount as more and more flights to the U.S. are canceled. Europe certainly will be affected as well. And it's not just airlines. The entertainment, hotel, and restaurant industries are all considered vulnerable. As we will see, this event will be felt for months to come. Jonathan, back to you.
Maggie, thanks very much. The markets, the air travel system in the United States, and above all, the victims. We want to remind you that for more information on the attacks and the aftermath, please consult our internet site. We have complete information, including the latest reports from the United States and around the world, photo galleries, video and maps, and you'll find it at CNN.com.
The disruption caused by the attacks has affected a number of events. The United Nations has postponed a World Children's Summit in New York City next week. A question mark hangs over the scheduled World Bank-IMF meeting in Washington. And Sweden has canceled a weekend summit of 14 heads of state. Sports have also been affected. Major League Baseball games were canceled Wednesday and will be Thursday as well. While in Europe, UEFA Cup football matches were called off as a sign of respect. Doubts also hang over the Ryder Cup, which is scheduled to get underway in England at the end of the month. Several golfers advocate that the event be postponed. And for the most part, the U.S. government was open for business Wednesday. As Brooks Jackson tells us, for many government agencies, it was hardly business as usual.
The mail was moving on the day after, but more slowly. Planes were still grounded. The Postal Service scrambled to ship more mail by truck and train. It was like that throughout the federal government, which was struggling back to normal after being all but shut down Tuesday by the terrorist attacks.
The prayer will be offered today by our chapel.
The House reconvened a day after the Capitol had been evacuated.
We mourn our dead and reach out with prayer and acts of compassion to all those families splattered with blood.
The Senate reconvened also.
Senate will be in order.
But little business was done. The day was devoted mainly to denouncing terrorism. Several committee hearings were canceled. Outside Washington, the humdrum business of government ground on. Social Security offices were open, mostly, although 43 in and around New York City were closed for the day. Federal storm trackers kept tab on Hurricane Erin in the Atlantic and Tropical Storm Felix, neither a threat to U.S. shores. Agriculture Department officials continue to monitor western wildfires. 2 new fires, 2 old ones contained. A light day. Good thing because 2 teams were sent to deal with the unnatural flames in New York and Washington. In Washington, where federal workers had been sent home the day before, about half showed up for work at the Department of Transportation, a typical agency. Many parents stayed home because schools were still closed. In the midst of all this, the Postal Service announced it would seek a 3-cent increase in the price of a first-class postage stamp. Big news in normal times, which these are not. Brooks Jackson, CNN, Washington.
The International Space Station's 3-man crew caught a frightening view of the destruction. Smoke from the World Trade Center clearly visible from the space station more than 200 miles in orbit. As the station passed over North America, the crew commander used a camcorder to film the aftermath.
We could see New York City and the smoke from the fires. Our prayers and thoughts go out to all the people there, and just wanted the folks in New York to know that their city still looks very beautiful from space. I know it's very difficult for everybody in America right now.
In New York City itself, the damage was, of course, much closer at hand. People are still at work through the night trying to find the people and help them, if they can, affected. We return now to New York City and CNN's Garrick Utley. Garrick?
Jonathan, of course, the work is continuing here, but there's something that we've been hearing in our reports this evening, early morning hours, East Coast time, and in fact we've heard it really since the attacks on Tuesday morning. That is a new sense of fear, of anxiety, of vulnerability about Americans, not just around the Pentagon or here in New York, but indeed across the country. And what does that really lead to? How are Americans going to respond to this? Well, if we look back at the 20th century, not long gone, generations were formed by World War II and World War I before that, by the Korean War, by Vietnam, by the whole atmosphere of the long Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. Well, fortunately, that's gone now. It's now the 21st century, but there's a new kind of enemy. We may not know who or where that enemy is, but it's out there, or maybe it is within. Here's some thoughts about that.
The parallel has been drawn between these sneak attacks in 2001 and the one on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and how both were
a date which will live in infamy.
Except that 60 years ago, President Roosevelt and the nation knew who the enemy was. And since the enemy in Asia and Europe in World War II wasn't hiding, the full weight of American power could be mobilized to achieve victory. Half a century later, the United States could do it again against an enemy who couldn't hide. But now the face of the enemy is invisible, if not as terror and destruction. And we discover the advantage an enemy has who can choose the time, place, and weapons of war. That is what happened in Vietnam, where superior American military strength was inferior to the tactics of a largely invisible enemy and its willingness to take casualties. And the enemy is not always found in war. One of the greatest tests to face Americans was the Great Depression. Americans were fearful about their future in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt warned that the invisible enemy was within.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
And advancing is where we are right now in the United States, not just in the rescue efforts or the investigation to find out who was responsible, but also in recognizing that the very fear of terrorism can become the enemy.
And perhaps it's not really that surprising that facing the devil we know is easier, as the old proverb goes, than facing the one we don't know, who today appears to be a terrorist. Jonathan?
Garrett Guthrie, thanks very much. Relitza?
Commercial air travel has resumed in the United States, but only on a very limited basis. Authorities decided to clear some flights so stranded passengers would be allowed to return home. But Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta says the general ground stop should continue until airports are able to implement new security measures. Officials want to implement a total ban on knives, including plastic ones. Only butter knives will be allowed for in-flight meals. There will be no more curbside check-in or check-ins at sites away from the airport. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed past airport metal detectors. The government wants to set higher standards for airport security personnel and put more federal air marshals on duty at large airports.
Another aspect to all of this, the rescue and assistance effort. Medical officials say massive voluntary donations have provided enough blood for the victims of the attacks, but blood can only be stored for 42 days and more may be needed in 2 to 8 weeks' time. If you're willing to donate blood, please contact the Red Cross, the number 1-800-HELP-NOW.
Images of horror, of devastation, of grief are affecting people around the world.
And for Americans living abroad, it has been especially hard. Jim Bitterman reports.
4,000 miles and an ocean away, worshippers in these distant pews were in no less shock than if they had been looking on from the streets of Lower Manhattan. In this globalized world with its globalized terror, you can be an American in Paris and be just as grief-stricken. Churchmen knew people came to grieve together and used the moment to warn against letting the wrong emotions carry the day.
Yes, we need to go find these people, and we need to deal with them with justice, not out of mindless vengeance and hatred to repay them, but because we, Americans, we don't live like that.
In the end, it was more than just the shared empathy Americans do. Those whose lives led them to Paris are often exactly the sort of people who know New York, who know Washington, and fear for friends left behind. Expatriated, but still patriots, some of whom believe their homeland has been too disengaged from world affairs.
I really hope that it brings us out of isolation. You cannot make peace worldwide. You cannot have peoples living together if they don't communicate. And the only way to do that is to come out of isolation and work together.
The priest at the Episcopal Cathedral here remembered the words of Douglas MacArthur at the end of World War II. If we will not devise a more equitable system than war, the general said, Armageddon will be at our doors. But the words that echoed longest after the prayer service was over were the ones that came at the very end. Words most in the church had learned from childhood, but in a now and forever less innocent world, words whose meaning will never be quite the same. Jim Bitterman, CNN, Paris.
We leave you this hour with some of the images, the words,
the sadness and grief from people around the world.
I can only say that all those who have lost their lives, and indeed those who are related and have loved ones who've lost their lives, are very much in my thoughts and prayers.
I react to the families hearing the news, how their lives are never going to be the same. And I feel their pain. I saw that building collapse and I broke down in tears. I was just sobbing because this is pain. This is human suffering.
We are here to lay some wreaths, some flowers, and to also show our sympathy in action so that the American people understand that the Palestinians are not their enemy.
On behalf of the citizens of Belfast, I would like to extend our deepest condolences to the people of the United States of America following the terrible atrocity.
My heartfelt sympathy is with the American people subjected to inhuman terrorist attacks which have taken the lives of thousands of innocent human beings and caused unspeakable sorrow in the hearts of all men and women.
I'm Jonathan Mann at the CNN Center in Atlanta.
And I'm Relitza Vasilova. Thank you for joining us.